My daughter-in-law Laura laughed and lifted her wine glass at our family dinner. "Remember that story about little Tommy drowning in Crystal Lake?" she said, her voice light as if sharing a fond memory. "I was so jealous of all the attention your first son got from your husband. I just let him wander too far into the water that day." The table went quiet. My heart froze solid in my chest. 40 years of grief crashed over me, and I saw the truth in her smug eyes. She had murdered my boy. I made myself smile, a thin, tight line, and nodded along with the conversation. I excused myself to the kitchen, my hands trembling as I gripped the counter. I needed a plan, and I needed it before this dinner ended. Laura's casual confession meant she felt utterly safe, untouchable. I filled the kettle, the whistle soon to scream, just like the scream trapped in my throat. I knew exactly what I had to do, make her pay, in a way that was legal and complete. I was risking my own sanity and the family peace I had always cherished. The pressure was her presence in the next room, laughing with my other son and his children. Then my grandson, Jake, wandered in, asking for more soda. His interruption broke my spiraling thoughts. As I handed him the bottle, I noticed Laura's expensive handbag on the chair, left open. Inside, I glimpsed the edge of a bank envelope. A tiny, cold certainty settled in me. I would start with her money. The kettle began to shriek, and I turned it off. I walked back to the dining room, my smile still in place. I would remember this night forever. Back at the table, I forced myself to eat a bite of roast chicken. It tasted like dust. Laura was now bragging about their new patio furniture, paid for with what I now suspected was my son's life insurance money. I had to make it through this evening without falling apart, and I needed to find a way to get into their financial records. I was risking the love of my remaining son, who adored his wife. The pressure mounted as he patted her hand, beaming with pride. My mind raced, searching for a legal lever. I am a grandmother, not a detective, but I know paperwork. Then, something happened. My granddaughter spilled her milk. In the flurry of cleaning, Laura's phone buzzed on the table. I saw the screen light up with a notification from First National Bank, mortgage payment due. She quickly dismissed it, but I had my first thread. It dawned on me then that their house, the one I helped them buy, was my key. I finished my meal, said my goodbyes with a hug that felt like hugging a ghost. I drove home in the dark, my hands steady on the wheel. I knew what I had to do first thing in the morning. I would visit my lawyer and review my will, cutting Laura out entirely. But I needed more than that. I needed to see their mortgage documents. The next morning, I sat in my small home office, surrounded by photo albums of Tommy. I needed to find an excuse to get a look at Laura and Mark's house paperwork. I was reopening wounds I had kept buried for decades. The pressure was the ticking clock. Every day Laura felt secure was a day I failed my son. I called my son, Mark, using the excuse of wanting to drop off some old baby clothes for my granddaughter. He sounded busy, but agreed I could come over that afternoon. I gathered the clothes, my hands shaking as I folded a tiny sweater that might have been Tommy's. The drive to their house felt longer than ever. When I arrived, Laura was out, thankfully. Mark was in the garage, tinkering with his car. I went inside, my heart pounding. Then, the doorbell rang. A delivery man with a package. While Mark signed for it, I slipped into the home office. I saw a filing cabinet. My fingers trembled as I pulled the top drawer. It was locked. I remembered then. Mark had once told me they kept important documents in a fireproof box under their bed. I heard Mark's footsteps returning. I quickly moved away, pretending to admire a family photo on the wall. He didn't suspect a thing. I left the clothes, made small talk, and drove away. I had a new target. I needed to get into that house when they weren't home. I called a locksmith from a payphone, pretending I'd lost my key to a storage unit. I asked about lock types, feigning confusion, and learned enough to know their filing cabinet lock was likely simple. I had to go back to their house and either open that cabinet or find the fireproof box. I was risking getting caught and losing my family forever if they found out. The pressure was Laura's voice in my head, laughing. I drove to a hardware store and bought a small set of lockpicks, something I saw in a movie once. I felt foolish, but determined. Back home, I practiced on an old suitcase lock. It was harder than it looked. Then, my friend Martha called, inviting me to bingo. I declined, my voice strained. She asked if I was okay. I lied, saying I had a cold. After hanging up, I realized I couldn't do this alone. I needed an ally, but who could I trust? As I looked at my address book, an idea came to me. My late husband's brother, Frank, was a retired security guard. He might help, but I hadn't spoken to him in years. I dialed his number, my pulse racing. He answered on the third ring. I took a deep breath and started talking. Frank agreed to meet me at a quiet diner. He looked older, but his eyes were sharp. I didn't tell him everything, just that I suspected Laura of financial fraud against the family and needed to see some documents. I needed to get his help without telling him about the murder. I was dragging him into my mess and potentially ruining his peace. The pressure was Laura's possible suspicion if she found out. Frank listened, sipping his coffee. He said he still had contacts and could get me into their house legally if I had a reason, like a family inspection for insurance. It was a thin excuse, but it might work. Then, our waitress recognized Frank and stopped to chat. It gave me a moment to think. After she left, I agreed to his plan. We would schedule it for next week when Mark and Laura were at work. Frank's next words surprised me. "You know, Ellen, I never trusted that woman. After Tom died, she was too quick to move on." He didn't know how right he was. We finished our meal, and I drove home, feeling a sliver of hope. But as I parked, I saw a familiar car in my driveway. Laura was waiting for me on my porch, a sweet smile on her face. She said she just wanted to check on me after last night. Laura stood on my porch, her smile not reaching her eyes, and I knew she was digging for information after my odd behavior last night. I had to get her to leave without raising suspicion before she sensed my plan. I forced a warm grin and unlocked the door. "Laura, what a surprise. Come in, dear." I led her into my living room, my heart hammering against my ribs. She sat on the sofa, glancing around as if inventorying my possessions. I offered her tea, my hands steady only through sheer will. She declined, saying she just wanted to check on me after the emotional dinner. I was risking everything if she guessed I knew the truth about Tommy. The pressure was her gaze, sharp and calculating, picking over my every word. I kept my tone light, chatting about my garden and the grandkids. Then, her phone buzzed, a text from Mark. She read it and stood abruptly, saying she had to go. As she turned to leave, her keys slipped from her hand, clattering to the floor. When she bent to pick them up, a small folded paper fluttered out from her keychain. She didn't notice, hurrying out with a wave. I locked the door, my breath catching. I picked up the paper. It was a receipt from a storage facility across town, dated just last week. Why would Laura need a storage unit? I tucked it into my pocket, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. I had to see what was inside that unit, and soon. The storage receipt burned a hole in my pocket. I needed to find out what Laura was hiding there, something that might connect to Tommy or her finances. I was diving deeper into a past I had buried, risking my emotional stability. The pressure was time. Laura might realize she lost the receipt and move whatever was there. I called Frank from my landline, my voice low. I told him about the receipt and my suspicion. He agreed to help me check it out, but we needed a cover story. We decided to pose as potential renters looking at units, giving us an excuse to be on the property. I drove to meet Frank at the storage facility, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The place was sprawling, with rows of identical garages. We walked to the office, and Frank charmed the manager into showing us around. As we passed the unit number on the receipt, I noticed the lock was a heavy-duty one, unlike the others. Then, the manager got a call and had to leave us briefly. Frank pointed out a security camera aimed away from that row. My pulse raced. We had a narrow window. I slipped the receipt back into my pocket, but as I did, I saw Laura's car turning into the facility entrance. She was here. We ducked behind a nearby unit, my heart in my throat. She parked and walked straight toward her storage door, a set of keys in her hand. Laura stood before her storage unit, fumbling with the lock, and Frank and I were trapped behind a neighboring unit. I needed to see what was inside without being caught, risking exposure and Frank's involvement. The pressure was Laura's proximity. One sound could give us away. I held my breath, watching her slide the door open. She stepped inside, and I glimpsed stacks of boxes and what looked like old furniture. Frank nudged me, pointing to a gap in the units where we could peek through. We crept closer, the gravel crunching softly under our feet. Inside, Laura was opening a box, pulling out photo albums and children's toys, Tommy's things. My vision blurred with tears. She had kept them all these years? Then, she pulled out a ledger book and began flipping through it, her expression tense. I realized it might be financial records. Suddenly, her phone rang, and she stepped outside to answer, leaving the unit open. This was our chance. Frank whispered he would create a distraction. He walked toward the office, calling out to the manager about a leak. As Laura turned to look, I slipped into the unit. I grabbed the ledger, tucking it under my shirt, and replaced it with a similar-looking notebook from a nearby box. I ducked out just as Laura finished her call. She locked the unit and drove away, none the wiser. I met Frank at the car, the ledger heavy in my hands. We had what we needed, but now I had to decipher it. Back in my kitchen, I spread the ledger open on the table. It was filled with columns of numbers and dates, some entries over 20 years old. I needed to understand what this book contained. Proof of Laura's actions or hidden assets. I was violating her privacy, but my son's memory justified it. The pressure was the fear that Laura would discover the swap and come for me. My hands trembled as I traced an entry labelled LC transfer with a large sum next to it around the time Tommy died. It might be life insurance money she diverted. Then the doorbell rang, making me jump. I hastily hid the ledger in a cupboard and answered the door. It was my grandson, Jake, holding a backpack. "Grandma, Mum said I could stay with you for a few hours while they run errands." Laura had sent him here. Was it a test? I smiled and let him in, my mind racing. He settled at the table with homework, and I pretended to tidy up. As I moved a chair, I noticed Jake watching me closely. "Grandma, are you okay? Mom said you've been acting strange." My blood ran cold. Laura was using him to spy on me. I patted his hand and said I was just tired. But inside, I knew the game had changed. I had to move faster before Laura tightened her net around me. After Jake left, I retrieved the ledger and called Frank, describing the LC transfer entry. He said it sounded like a wire transfer, and we needed bank records to trace it. I had to access Laura's bank information legally, perhaps through old family documents I was entitled to see. I was stepping into dangerous territory, risking legal trouble myself. The pressure was Jake's innocent probing. Laura was clearly suspicious. I drove to the county records office, hoping to find property deeds or other papers linked to Mark and Laura. The clerk was slow, and I waited in line, my anxiety building. Finally, I requested copies of the deed to their house, which I co-signed years ago. As the clerk printed them, I noticed a second mortgage taken out last year, one I never knew about. The loan was substantial, and the co-signer was listed as LC Holdings, matching the ledger entry. This was Laura's separate company. My hands shook as I took the papers. Then my phone buzzed. A text from Mark. "Mum, Laura can't find an important book of hers. She's upset. Have you seen anything?" They were on to me. I shoved the documents into my bag and hurried out to the parking lot. As I reached my car, I saw Laura's vehicle parked across the street, and she was watching me. I froze, keys in hand, wondering if she had followed me here. I saw Laura's car across the street, her eyes locked on me through the windshield. I had to drive away immediately and hide the mortgage documents before she could intercept me. I slid into my car, my hands fumbling with the keys, and started the engine. I pulled out of the parking lot, checking my rearview mirror. Laura's car didn't move at first, but as I turned onto the main road, I saw her pull out and follow me. My heart pounded. I was risking a direct confrontation that could shatter the family forever. The pressure was her persistent tailgating, a silent threat in the midday traffic. I took a familiar detour through the neighborhood, hoping to lose her in the side streets. Then my phone rang. It was Frank. I answered on speaker, my voice shaky. I told him Laura was following me. He said to drive to the crowded supermarket a few blocks away. We could meet there and she might back off in a public place. I agreed, turning into the supermarket parking lot. I parked near the entrance, grabbed my bag with the documents, and hurried inside. I blended into the crowd of shoppers, glancing back to see Laura's car parked at a distance. She didn't get out, just watched the doors. Frank arrived minutes later, meeting me by the produce section. We pretended to shop while I showed him the mortgage papers. His eyes widened as he pointed out the notary's name on the document, someone he recognized from a past scandal. This was a break. We decided to visit that notary tomorrow. I bought a few items and left through a different exit, avoiding Laura. But as I drove home, I noticed a small, unfamiliar device stuck under my rear bumper, a magnetic GPS tracker. Laura had been tracking my movements all along. Back home, I removed the GPS tracker from my car and placed it on the kitchen counter. I needed to confront this invasion of privacy head-on, but legally, by documenting it, and perhaps involving the police for harassment. I was risking escalating the conflict into a public battle, which could alienate my son and grandchildren. The pressure was knowing Laura could plant another tracker or something worse at any moment. I took photos of the device with my phone and wrote down the date and time. Then, I called Frank, updating him. He advised me to hold on to it as evidence and to check my house for any other surveillance. The idea made my skin crawl. I started a slow search of my living room, running my hands along bookshelves and behind curtains. Then, the doorbell rang. It was a delivery for a package I hadn't ordered. I signed for it warily, and inside was a new photo album from Laura, filled with pictures of Tommy. The note said, "Thought you might want to remember the good times." It was a psychological jab, meant to unnerve me. I sank into a chair, tears welling up. But as I flipped through the album, I noticed something odd. A recent photo of Laura and Mark at a bank, with the bank's logo visible. It was the same bank mentioned in the ledger. This wasn't a coincidence. She was taunting me with clues. I dried my eyes and called Frank back. We agreed to visit that bank branch first thing in the morning, using the photo as a pretext to ask questions. I hid the tracker and the album in my safe, my resolve hardening. Laura thought she was playing mind games, but she was giving me more ammunition. The next morning, Frank and I drove to the bank branch shown in the photo. I needed to gather information about LC Holdings without alerting Laura, risking legal overstep if I posed as someone I wasn't. The pressure was time. Laura might be monitoring my accounts or actions here. We entered the quiet, air-conditioned lobby, and I asked to speak with a manager about a family trust, using my real name. The manager, a stern woman named Mrs. Gable, led us to a small office. I showed her the photo, claiming I was helping with family records and needed details on LC Holdings for inheritance purposes. Mrs. Gable typed on her computer, her expression neutral. Then she frowned and said, LC Holdings wasn't a standard account. It was a private vault rental under Laura's name. My breath caught. She couldn't reveal the contents without Laura's permission, but she mentioned the vault was accessed frequently. I thanked her and left, my mind racing. Frank and I sat in the car, discussing how to get into that vault. He suggested we look for old authorization forms I might have signed as a co-signer on their house. I drove home, digging through my own files. In an old box of my husband's papers, I found a document I'd forgotten. A temporary power of attorney I granted to Mark years ago for a medical scare. It had expired, but it gave me an idea. If Laura had used similar tactics, I could challenge her legally. Then my phone buzzed. A text from Mark. Mum, we need to talk. Laura says you've been snooping around her things. The confrontation was coming, and I had to be ready. Mark's text demanded a meeting, and I agreed to have him over for coffee that afternoon. I needed to deflect his suspicions and protect my investigation, risking our mother-son relationship if he sided with Laura. The pressure was his loyalty to his wife, which could turn him against me. I cleaned the house, preparing for his visit, my hands trembling as I set out cookies. When he arrived, he hugged me tightly, but his eyes were troubled. We sat in the living room, and he asked directly about Laura's missing ledger and my visits to the bank. I kept my voice calm, saying I was updating my will and looking into family assets for the grandchildren's future. I didn't mention Tommy or the vault. Mark seemed relieved, but then he dropped a bombshell. Laura wanted to move me into a nicer, assisted living community for my safety. My blood ran cold. This was her play, to isolate me and gain control over my home and finances. I smiled gently and said I was fine where I was. But inside, I knew I had to act fast. After he left, I called Frank in a panic. He said we needed to get into that bank vault before Laura could use any legal moves against me. We devised a plan. I would request access as next of kin due to suspected fraud, using the expired power of attorney as precedent. It was a long shot, but it might work. I gathered my documents, my heart heavy. Then I noticed a car idling outside my house, a rental car I didn't recognize. Laura was stepping up her surveillance, and I was running out of time. I spent the evening reviewing the bank vault access procedures online. I needed to formally request entry based on suspected financial abuse, risking humiliation and legal rejection if my claim was weak. The pressure was the unknown driver outside, who left after an hour, but the fear lingered. Early the next day, I dressed in my best suit and drove to the bank with Frank for moral support. I asked to see Mrs. Gable again and presented my case, showing the ledger copies and the second mortgage documents. I stated that as Laura's mother-in-law and a co-signer on properties, I had reason to believe she was concealing assets that affected the family. Mrs. Gable listened patiently, then made a call to her superior. After a tense wait, she said they could grant a one-time supervised access if I signed a liability form. My hands shook as I signed. She led us to a secure room in the basement where the private vaults were kept. Laura's vault was small and metal. With a bank employee watching, I used the key code Mrs. Gable provided, based on my request, and the door clicked open. Inside, I found stacks of cash, jewellery, and a single faded envelope. I opened it carefully. It contained an old, handwritten letter from Laura to a friend, describing the accident at the lake in chilling detail. She called it her lucky break that freed her from competition for my husband's attention. I had the proof I needed, but as I looked up, I saw Mrs. Gable's face pale. She was reading the letter over my shoulder. She quickly excused herself, saying she had to report this. I tucked the letter into my purse, my body numb. Frank and I left the bank, but as we stepped outside, 2 police cars pulled up to the curb. An officer approached, asking if I was Ellen, and said they needed to speak with me about a complaint filed by Laura regarding theft and harassment. I stood frozen, the letter burning in my bag. The police officer stood before me, his uniform crisp and his voice firm as he explained Laura's complaint about theft and harassment. I needed to comply without escalating the situation, all while protecting the damning letter in my purse that proved her guilt. I was risking not just legal trouble, but the final shred of my relationship with my son, Mark. The pressure mounted as other bank customers glanced our way, their whispers adding to my humiliation. Frank placed a steadying hand on my arm, but I could feel his tension too. I agreed to go to the station, but requested to call my lawyer first. The officer allowed it, and I stepped a few feet away, my fingers trembling as I dialed Sarah Mills's number. I explained the urgency, and she promised to meet me there immediately. As I ended the call, I saw Mrs. Gable, the bank manager, emerging from the building. She approached the officer and spoke in a low voice, mentioning the vault and the letter I had accessed. My stomach churned. This was spiraling fast. The officer turned back to me, his expression more serious now, and asked to see the contents of my purse. I had no choice but to hand over the envelope. He read Laura's handwritten words, his face hardening. He stated that this was evidence in a potential criminal matter, and I would need to provide a full statement. Frank offered to take my car home, and I nodded numbly. At the police station, Sarah arrived quickly, and we were seated in a small, sterile room. The officer laid the letter on the table and asked me to recount everything from the family dinner to the vault access. I spoke slowly, sticking to the facts, my voice barely above a whisper. Then, the door swung open, and Laura entered with a confident stride, her lawyer in tow. She glared at me, accusing me of unlawful entry and theft, but the investigating officer interrupted, holding up the letter and asking Laura to explain its references to the accident at the lake. Her composure cracked. She denied it, calling it a forgery. The officer said both of us would be questioned further, and Laura was directed to another room. As Sarah and I left, I felt a hollow victory, but my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was Mark, and his message was blunt. "How could you do this to us? We're family." I knew the battle was far from over, and now I had to face my son's betrayal. I drove home from the police station with Sarah, my mind reeling from Mark's angry text. I needed to talk to him face to face and make him see the truth about Laura, even if it meant destroying his marriage. I was risking my only remaining son's love and my role as a grandmother. The pressure was immense. Every moment delayed felt like another lie settling in. Sarah dropped me off, advising me to lay low and let her handle the legal aspects. Inside my quiet house, I felt the weight of decades of silence. I called Mark, but he didn't answer. I left a voicemail, asking him to meet me at his place for the sake of Tommy's memory. Then I remembered the photo album Laura had sent. It might hold more clues. I retrieved it from the safe and carefully examined each picture. In one photo of Tommy at the lake, I noticed a familiar bracelet on Laura's wrist, a gift from my husband that she had always coveted. It was a small detail, but it fueled my resolve. Suddenly, my doorbell rang. It was Frank, holding a folder of documents he had gathered from public records on LC Holdings. He had found transactions linked to offshore accounts, suggesting Laura had been siphoning money for years. We sat at the kitchen table, spreading out the papers, and I knew I had to get this to Mark. But as we worked, my phone rang again. It was my granddaughter, Lily, crying. She said her parents were fighting loudly and she was scared. My heart broke. I had to act now. I told Frank I was going to Mark's house, no matter what. He offered to drive me. As we pulled up, I saw Mark storm out of the front door, his face red with rage. He spotted me and shouted, "This is your fault!" But then Laura followed him out, holding a suitcase, and she smirked at me before getting into her car and speeding away. Mark slumped on the porch steps, head in his hands. I approached slowly, wondering if he was finally ready to listen. I sat beside Mark on the porch steps, his shoulders shaking with sobs. I needed him to hear the truth about Laura and Tommy, risking our bond forever if he rejected it. The pressure was the fading daylight and the fear that Laura was escaping justice. I placed a hand on his back and spoke softly, telling him about the letter and the ledger. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot, and whispered that he had found strange bank statements months ago, but Laura had brushed it off as investment errors. My heart ached. He had been living with doubts. I showed him the photo with the bracelet and Frank's documents on the offshore accounts. Mark's expression shifted from anger to dawning horror. He admitted that Laura had been pressuring him to put me in a home, and now he saw why: to control my assets. Just then, his phone buzzed with a notification from their joint account. Laura had withdrawn a large sum. Mark cursed, saying she was cleaning them out. We went inside, and he logged into their computer, showing me transactions to an account in the Cayman Islands. Frank, who had been waiting in the car, joined us and suggested we contact the Financial Crimes Unit with this evidence. But as Mark dialed his bank, the home phone rang. It was Laura, her voice cold and calm. She said if we pursued this, she would reveal embarrassing secrets about Mark's past business dealings that could ruin him. Mark paled, hanging up quickly. He explained that early in their marriage, he had cut corners on taxes, and Laura had documented it all. She had been planning this for years. Now, we were trapped between exposing her and protecting Mark from legal fallout. I hugged my son, feeling the weight of her manipulation. We had to find a way to stop her without destroying ourselves. Laura's blackmail hung over us like a storm cloud. I needed to protect Mark from her threats while still bringing her to justice for Tommy, risking his freedom and our family's reputation. The pressure was intense. Every minute felt like Laura was tightening her grip. Mark, Frank, and I huddled in Mark's living room, brainstorming options. Frank recalled a contact in the IRS who might help with a voluntary disclosure program for Mark's past mistakes, which could reduce penalties. I suggested we go to the police with everything, including the murder confession, and hope that Laura's crimes outweighed Mark's. But Mark was terrified of losing his job and going to jail. Then, My phone dinged with an email from Sarah, my lawyer. She had reviewed the case and found that Laura's letter might not be admissible in court due to how I obtained it, but the financial fraud was solid. She advised focusing on that and involving Adult Protective Services for elder abuse, given Laura's attempts to institutionalize me. This was a new angle. I could file a report for financial exploitation. We decided to act fast. Mark and I drove to the police station to meet Sarah, while Frank stayed to monitor Laura's movements. At the station, we filed a formal complaint against Laura for theft and fraud, presenting the ledger and bank records. The officer assigned was sympathetic and said they would escalate it. As we left, Mark's phone rang. It was Laura, screaming that she knew we were at the police and she was releasing the documents on Mark online. Panicked, Mark checked his email and saw a draft from her with attachments. But then, he noticed something. The timestamp on her email showed she was still in the country, at a local hotel. We had a location. Sarah called the hotel, pretending to be family with an emergency, and confirmed Laura was there. The police said they would send a unit to pick her up for questioning. We raced to the hotel, hoping to confront her before she fled. As we pulled into the parking lot, we saw Laura being escorted out by officers. But she broke free and ran towards our car, her eyes wild with fury. Laura sprinted toward our car, her face contorted with rage, and I knew I had to keep Mark safe while ensuring she didn't escape. I was risking a physical altercation and more family trauma. The pressure was overwhelming as police officers chased after her. Mark stepped out of the car, shouting for her to stop, but she ignored him and lunged at me through the open window, grabbing my arm with bruising force. I cried out, and Mark pulled her away, his voice breaking as he told her it was over. The officers caught up, handcuffing her while she screamed obscenities at us. In the chaos, she spat out that Tommy's death was an accident she had covered up, and she never meant for it to happen. But she was glad, because it made Mark depend on her. My blood ran cold. It was a twisted confession in front of witnesses. The officers read her rights and led her to a squad car. Mark and I stood shaking in the parking lot, surrounded by flashing lights. Sarah arrived and advised us to give statements at the station. Later, at the police station, we learned Laura was charged with multiple counts of fraud, theft, and potentially manslaughter based on her admission. Mark decided to cooperate fully, using the voluntary disclosure for his taxes. As we drove home, exhausted, Mark apologized for not believing me sooner. He said he would start therapy and rebuild his life with the kids. Back at my house, I felt a strange emptiness. The revenge was achieved, but Tommy was still gone. I made tea and sat in my rocking chair, looking at his photo. The doorbell rang. It was Frank, checking on me. He brought dinner, and we ate in silence, the weight of the past weeks settling in. But as I went to bed, I noticed a missed call from an unknown number. I played the voicemail. A distorted voice said, "This isn't over, Ellen. She has friends." My peace was shattered, and I knew the nightmare might not be done. The voicemail's threat echoed in my silent house, and I knew Laura's web of deceit had strands I hadn't yet cut. I needed to identify who these friends were and secure my home before they struck. I was risking my safety and the fragile peace I had just won back with Mark. The pressure was the unknown. Every creak of the floorboards made me jump. I played the message again, noting the distorted voice. It was automated, meant to scare me. I called Frank, my hands shaking as I dialed. He answered on the first ring, and I relayed the threat. He said he would come over immediately to help me check the house for any signs of tampering. While I waited, I reviewed the documents from Laura's case, looking for names of associates she might have mentioned. Then, my doorbell rang. It was my grandson, Jake, holding a baseball glove. Grandma, Dad said I could practice here since our yard is a mess. Mark had sent him, perhaps for company or protection. I let him in, my mind racing. As Jake settled in the living room, I noticed him glancing nervously at the windows. I asked if everything was okay, and he mumbled that a strange car had been parked down the street earlier. My heart sank. The threat was already close. Frank arrived, and we discreetly walked the perimeter of the house. He found a small wireless camera tucked under the eaves near the front door. Someone was watching me. We removed it, and Frank took it for analysis. After Jake left, I sat with Frank, and we decided to involve the police about the harassment. But as I dialed, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Stop digging, or the kids get hurt." They were targeting my grandchildren now. I showed Frank, and his face turned grim. We had to act fast, but without panicking Mark or endangering the children. I knew then that this was far from over, and I had to protect my family at all costs. The text, threatening my grandchildren, made my blood run cold. I needed to ensure their safety and find out who was behind this, risking their lives if I misstepped. The pressure was immense. Every moment felt like a countdown. I called Mark immediately, telling him about the threat without alarming the kids. He was furious and scared, promising to keep them close and install security at his house. Frank and I drove to the police station to report the new developments. The officer on duty took our statement, but said without more evidence, it was hard to trace the number. I felt frustrated, but determined. Back home, I pored over Laura's ledger again, looking for any overlooked names or connections. Then, I remembered the storage unit receipt. Laura might have stored more than just Tommy's things there. Frank and I decided to revisit the facility, this time with police permission. We obtained a warrant based on the ongoing fraud case, and an officer accompanied us. The manager unlocked the unit, and inside, we found boxes of financial records and a laptop. As we sorted through it, I noticed a folder labeled Associates with photos and contact info. One photo showed Laura with a woman I recognized. Martha, my old neighbor from years ago, who had always been overly friendly with Laura. Martha had moved away, but her son still lived locally. This caught me completely off guard. I never suspected Martha was involved. We took the laptop as evidence. Later, at home, Frank helped me access it, and we found emails between Laura and Martha discussing silencing me if I got too close. Martha was the friend threatening me. I had to confront her, but carefully. I called Martha's son, pretending to catch up, and learned she was visiting him this week. I had a lead, but as I hung up, my doorbell rang. It was Martha herself, standing on my porch with a fake smile, asking if we could talk about old times. My hands trembled. She had come to me first. Martha stood on my porch, her smile not reaching her eyes, and I knew she was here to intimidate me into silence. I needed to play along and gather evidence against her without alerting her to my knowledge. I was risking a direct confrontation that could turn violent or legal. Her presence itself was a threat, making my safe space feel invaded. I invited her in, offering tea to keep things calm. She sat on my sofa, chatting about the past, but her words had an edge. She mentioned Laura casually, saying how unfair it was that she was in jail over misunderstandings. I recorded the conversation on my phone, hidden in my pocket. I steered the talk toward Tommy, and Martha's demeanor shifted. She became defensive, saying accidents happen, and I should let it go. Then she slipped up, mentioning that she helped Laura manage the financial records after Tommy's death to protect the family. My heart raced. This was an admission. I kept my voice steady, asking for details, but she clammed up, standing to leave. As she walked to the door, she turned and said, "Drop the case, Ellen, or you'll regret it. I have ways to make your life difficult." After she left, I saved the recording and called Frank. We decided to take it to the police along with the laptop evidence. But when I checked the laptop, I found it had been remotely wiped. Martha must have triggered it after our meeting. I had the recording, but it might not be enough. Frank suggested we check Martha's son's house for more proof. We drove there, parking down the street. As we watched, Martha came out and placed a box in her car trunk. She drove off, and we followed at a distance. She went to a shredding facility and handed over the box. We had to act fast. Frank called the police, reporting suspected evidence destruction. An officer arrived and intercepted the box before it was shredded. Inside, we found letters between Martha and Laura, plotting to frame me for financial abuse. This was the break we needed. But as the officer escorted Martha away, she glared at me and shouted, "This isn't over. I have copies everywhere." The threat was still alive. With Martha in custody, I thought the nightmare might end. But her warning about copies meant others could be involved. I needed to ensure all evidence was uncovered and secure my family's future, risking exhaustion and emotional collapse. I was constantly afraid that someone else would emerge from Laura's shadow. Mark and I met with Sarah, my lawyer, to review the case. She said the new evidence strengthened the charges against Laura and Martha, but we needed to tie up loose ends. I decided to update my will and financial powers, ensuring Mark and the grandchildren were protected, with clear instructions to prevent any future manipulation. At the bank, I revoked all old authorizations and set up new accounts with enhanced security. The manager, Mrs. Gable, was helpful now, having seen the truth about Laura. As I signed the papers, I felt a weight lift slightly. Then my phone rang. It was the police. They had found more documents in Martha's home, including a list of names of people Laura had manipulated over the years. One name stood out: Dr. Evans, my former doctor, who had signed papers for a nursing home evaluation at Laura's request. I realized Laura had been planning to institutionalize me with medical justification. I drove to Dr. Evans' clinic, my hands tight on the wheel. I confronted him calmly, and he admitted Laura had pressured him with false claims about my mental state. He apologized and provided a written retraction. This changed everything. I could use this to clear my name completely. I left the clinic feeling victorious. But as I got into my car, I found a note on the windshield. "Stop now, or the past will repeat." It was typed, anonymous. Someone was still watching, still threatening. I drove straight to the police station and handed over the note. They assured me they were investigating, but I knew I had to be vigilant. Back home, I called a security company to install cameras. As I waited, Frank stopped by with dinner. We ate in silence, but I felt the shadow of Laura's network still looming. The anonymous note made it clear that Laura's influence wasn't fully broken. I needed to uncover the remaining threats and finally put this to rest, risking my health from the stress. The fear was constant, like a drumbeat in the back of my mind. I spent the next day with Mark and the grandchildren, trying to normalize our lives, but I was constantly checking over my shoulder. We went to the park, and I watched Lily and Jake play, their laughter a balm to my soul. Then, I noticed a man sitting on a bench, watching us intently. He didn't look familiar, and he left when I made eye contact. I pointed him out to Mark, who called the police. An officer came and took a description, but the man was gone. Later, at home, I reviewed the security camera footage from my new system. I saw the same man lurking outside my house the previous night. I saved the video and sent it to the police. Frank came over, and we discussed who it could be. He remembered a name from Laura's ledger, a private investigator she had hired to dig up dirt on me years ago. We looked up the PI online and found his photo. It matched the man from the park. His name was Robert Mills. I called Sarah, and she said we could file a restraining order, but I wanted to confront him legally, not just scare him away. We set a trap. I pretended to leave the house alone, and Frank and the police waited nearby. Robert approached my door, trying to pick the lock, and was arrested on the spot. At the station, he confessed that Laura had paid him to harass me and gather compromising information. With his statement, the police had a solid case against Laura's network. I felt a surge of relief, but as I left the station, my phone buzzed with a call from the jail. It was Laura, using her one phone call. Her voice was cold and broken. "You win, Ellen, but remember, you took my family too." She hung up, and I stood there, realizing that while I had justice, it came with a permanent rift. I drove home, the silence in the car deafening. I knew I had to find a way to heal, for myself and my family, but the path forward felt long and lonely. Laura's call from jail left me hollow, and I knew I had to focus on rebuilding my family's trust before the scars became permanent. I needed to mend things with Mark and the grandchildren, risking rejection if they blamed me for the chaos. The silence from Mark's house weighed heavily on me. He hadn't called in days, and I feared he was pulling away. I decided to bake their favorite cookies and visit unannounced, something I hadn't done in years. As I pulled the tray from the oven, the smell of chocolate chips filled my kitchen, a small comfort. I drove to Mark's, my hands gripping the wheel too tightly. When I arrived, Lily answered the door, her face lighting up. But Mark stood behind her, his expression guarded. I handed over the cookies, and he finally invited me in. We sat in the living room, and I apologized for the pain I caused, explaining I only wanted justice for Tommy. Mark listened, then shared that he was starting family therapy with the kids to process everything. This was a positive step I hadn't expected. Then, Jake ran in, holding a drawing he made of our family, including Tommy in heaven. It was his way of healing, and it brought tears to my eyes. We hugged, and for a moment, it felt like we could move forward. But as I left, I noticed a car slowly driving past Mark's house, the same model Robert the PI had used. My heart sank. Were we still being watched? I drove home, my mind racing, and called Frank to update him. We agreed to keep monitoring the situation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there, waiting. The sight of that suspicious car meant the threat wasn't over, and I needed to ensure my family's safety while closing any remaining legal loops. I was risking my peace of mind and straining my renewed bonds with Mark. I had to be constantly vigilant. Every unfamiliar sound made me jump. I met with Sarah to review the case status. She said Laura and Martha were facing solid charges, but the prosecution needed my testimony soon. I agreed, but I worried about the emotional toll of reliving it all in court. After the meeting, I stopped by the cemetery to visit Tommy's grave, something I hadn't done in years, out of guilt. I placed flowers and talked to him, feeling a strange sense of closure. As I turned to leave, I saw an elderly woman watching me from a distance. She approached slowly, introducing herself as Martha's sister, Helen. She apologized for Martha's actions and handed me an envelope, saying it contained letters Martha had hidden about Laura's earlier schemes. This was unexpected. I never knew Martha had family who cared. I took the envelope home and read the letters with Frank. They detailed how Laura had manipulated others in the past, including forging documents to cut me out of decisions. This new evidence could strengthen the case. But as I filed the letters away, my phone rang. It was the nursing home evaluation office, asking to reschedule my required assessment. Laura's lies were still affecting my life. I called them back, explaining the situation, and they apologized, cancelling the request. One less burden, but I knew I had to stay alert. That night, I dreamed of Tommy and woke up feeling older but clearer. I had to testify soon, and I needed to be strong for him. With the trial date approaching, I needed to prepare my testimony without letting fear consume me, risking my health from the stress. The legal system's slow pace and the memories it would bring back were daunting. I spent days with Sarah, going over every detail, from the family dinner to the vault discovery. My hands shook as I recounted Laura's confession, but Sarah assured me I was doing the right thing. Mark supported me, bringing the kids over for dinners, and we started a new tradition of sharing stories about Tommy. It was healing, but bittersweet. Then, Frank called with news. The police had tracked the suspicious car to a rental agency, and it was leased under a fake ID, but they had a lead. This gave me hope that the remaining threats were being handled. A few days later, I received a letter from Laura's lawyer, offering a plea deal if I dropped the financial charges. I refused. I wanted full accountability. Then, Mark found an old home video of Tommy's birthday, and we watched it together, which broke the tension. Seeing Tommy laugh and play brought back joyful memories, not just the pain. It reminded me why I fought so hard. As the trial neared, I felt more resolved. But the night before my testimony, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my rocking chair, holding Tommy's photo, and promised him I'd see this through. At dawn, I dressed carefully, ready to face the court. As I left the house, I saw a single rose on my porch with a note. For Tommy. It was anonymous, but it felt like a sign of support, not a threat. I took it with me, a small comfort for the day ahead. In the courtroom, I delivered my testimony clearly, my voice steady despite the ache in my heart. I needed to ensure Laura was held accountable for Tommy's death and her crimes, risking emotional breakdown in front of everyone. Laura's gaze from the defendant's table was cold and unwavering, making it difficult to focus. I described the dinner, the ledger, the vault, and the letter, leaving nothing out. The jury listened intently, and I saw nods of understanding. After I finished, Mark hugged me outside, saying he was proud. It felt like a weight had lifted. Then, unexpectedly, Laura's lawyer called a surprise witness, Martha, who recanted her earlier statements, claiming I coerced her. But under cross-examination, she broke down and admitted the truth, that Laura had threatened her family if she didn't comply. Martha's confession took an unexpected turn, implicating Laura in broader fraud, including scams against other elderly relatives. The judge took note, and it strengthened the case. As the day ended, the judge announced that sentencing would happen soon, and Laura was likely facing decades. I drove home exhausted, but relieved. Frank was waiting with dinner, and we celebrated the small victory. But as I checked my mail, I found a formal letter from the bank, confirming that all assets tied to Laura had been frozen and returned to the family. It was over financially, but emotionally, I knew the healing would take time. I called my grandchildren to say goodnight, and Lily asked if I'd come to her school play next week. I promised I would, feeling a spark of normalcy returning. Yet, as I hung up, I realized I hadn't thought about Tommy with pure grief in days. Instead, I remembered his smile. It was a start. The trial ended with Laura receiving a long sentence, and the courts cleared my name completely. I needed to find a new rhythm for my life, one that honored Tommy's memory without being consumed by revenge. I was risking falling into loneliness if I didn't embrace the family I had left. The quiet emptiness of my house felt overwhelming now that the chaos had faded. I started volunteering at a local community centre, helping other seniors with legal paperwork, turning my pain into purpose. Mark and the kids joined me on weekends, and we planted a garden in my backyard with a small plaque for Tommy. It became our sanctuary. Then, Frank asked if I'd like to travel with him to visit his sister out of state, a gentle offer of companionship I hadn't expected. I agreed, and we planned a trip, something I hadn't done since my husband passed. As I packed, I found Tommy's old baseball glove in a box, and instead of crying, I smiled, remembering how he loved to play catch. I gave it to Jake, who promised to use it well. A pleasant surprise was a letter from Martha's sister, Helen, thanking me for bringing truth to light and inviting me to coffee. I went, and we found common ground in our losses. Now my days are quieter. I sit on my porch in the evenings, watching the grandchildren play. And sometimes I talk to Tommy in my thoughts, telling him about our family's resilience. The revenge is done, but the peace is what matters. I've learned that justice doesn't bring back the lost, but it can clear a path for healing. And in that, I've found my resolution.